Better watch yourself, said John. Why, I've got you now, Johnny. My brother's keeper, said Stephen, slapping John on the back. We're a team, we are, he told the bartender. He's driving. I'm saying goodbye to Paul. He died out of turn, said John. Couldn't be helped. Michael was always the impatient one, said Stephen. Rush, 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 that was Michael. Rushed his way into an early grave. Time's winged chariot, said John. Time's rocket sled. I don't hold with funerals myself, said Stephen, receiving his drink. I detest them. They're so gloomy. You don't like any formal occasions, said John. Married twice, he eloped both times, he told the bartender. Save money, said Stephen, and all the bother. Practical. You should respond to that, Johnny. And yet very romantic. Spur of the moment. They like that. Sweep them off their feet. That's the way to do it. Neither one took, said John. Yes, but I had 2 wonderful honeymoons, said Stephen. Glorious. Lip-smacking. Thank you, sir, he said, offering a toast to the ceiling. Always the short term for you, Stephen, said John. Ah, but the memories, said Stephen. The memories, Johnny. Sweet, unsullied memories to last me a lifetime. So much better than an old hag to dog my final days. You'll be alone, said John. No comfort there. Comfort is something I've never wanted, said Stephen. Comfort is what ruined it each time. Well, you'll only die but the once, said John. Amen to that, said Stephen. And no funeral, please. You won't have to attend, said John. You should appreciate that feature of it, the one function designed expressly for you. Just respect my wishes and dispense with the ceremony, will you, said Stephen. No words, no flowers. Weddings, baptisms, christenings, and funerals, I've already had my fill. White for weddings, black for the funeral. Purity and stain. Hail and farewell. I don't know as anyone genuinely likes a funeral, said John, other than the morticians. Oh, I know, but it seems that dying is really bad enough, said Stephen. It ought to be enough, without them tricking you out in a monkey suit like you were going to a ball and putting you in a box, setting you up there like a used car. Funerals are for the living, said John. You mean the lesson to be learned, said Stephen, by looking death in the face? I mean the family, said John, the bereaved, the others who come to pay their respects. A lot of people we never knew, said Stephen, mournful faces. They look like basset hounds, shaking my hand. So. They came to say goodbye, said John. Can't deprive them of that. I'll say my goodbyes now, then, said Stephen. Send a card around. Cheerio! He waved his hand in farewell. John and the bartender laughed. And when it happens, I'll have them dress me all up in white, said Stephen. White it is. I'll be the proper bride of Christ. 2 elopements, and now he wants to be a bride, said John. No, when my time comes, I want to be cremated, said Stephen, while his brother and the bartender laughed. I don't fancy the idea of being shut up in some box and tucked away in the ground. Food for worms. I'd rather be burned and scattered, let the wind blow me away. I guess I'm more traditional, said John. I'd like to be with the family in the plot by mother and father's headstone. It isn't cozy, you know, said Stephen. No, said John, but that's where I want to be. That's the way I want it. And then what, said Stephen. What do you mean, said John. After that, said Stephen. Then what? Anything? John did not answer. Timothy, said Stephen, any conjecture on that point? What happens to us after we die? Asked the bartender, stopping his work to ponder. Stephen nodded. The bartender scratched his jaw. I think we go on living, existing, some part of us in some way, he said. The soul, said John. Reincarnation, said Stephen. Maybe, said the bartender. But we don't just stop, said Stephen. No, I don't think so, said the bartender. Not completely, not permanently. Something goes on. Well, that's reassuring, said Stephen. But I don't know, said the bartender. My good brother here, former altar boy that he is, believes in heaven and hell, the pearly gates, St. Peter, Gabriel and his trumpet, the choir of angels, the purgative fire, eternal torment, the whole shebang, said Stephen. An extremely elaborate 5-star production, very lavish. The Rockettes, Radio City Music Hall, the Dallas Cowboy Cheerleaders. Armageddon, said John. Judgment Day. The final reckoning, said Stephen. Gloom and doom. Or salvation, said John. It's quite suspenseful. It does give you something to look forward to, said Stephen. My notion is not that lively. You don't believe in life after death, said John. Well, look at the evidence, said Stephen. What have we got to go on? Paul didn't look especially vibrant. That was only his mortal coil, said John. True, said Stephen, and to be honest, he appeared better than when I last saw him. A slight improvement, so things may be looking up. I can't imagine facing nothing, said John, waving a hand in the air. Very suspenseful, said Stephen, in its own way. A mighty big step. They sat there quietly for a while. The bartender dried some glasses, then asked John if he'd like another drink. No, thank you, Timothy, he said. One's my limit. The bartender was whistling softly as he dried the glasses. Stephen said, I'll tell you a bit of a story if you'll fix me another, Tim. Should you? Said John. It's a good story, said Stephen. Father used to tell it, about old man O'Brien. I meant the drink, said John. I know, said Stephen. You know, Tim, I used to know an old bartender. He'd slip me a free drink if I could tell him a story that would make him laugh. Sorry, I can't do that, said the bartender, setting down the drink. Oh, I know, you're a businessman, and I'm willing to pay, said Stephen. Now it's the stories that are free. This one's about old man O'Brien, a mean, mean man, the terror of the neighborhood he was. Born a demon, raised to play the devil, then drink finished the job, turned him into a perfect monster. No one could stand the man. This story is true, said John. I wouldn't be lying about something as true as this, said Stephen. Everyone hated this man, feared and hated him. He was the very devil incarnate. You understand, Tim? The bartender nodded. And when he died, people came round only for the sake of his family. His poor widow, Mary, a long-suffering one she was. My God, to be married to that beast. There's a chain. But he's dead, he's gone, and we're at the funeral. And one man in the neighborhood, known to be a decent man, but not too bright, he passed by the casket, looked down at the brute, turned to the widow, twisted his hat in his hands, searching for something he could say, some balm for her grief, a few words of consolation, and finally he said, Well, Mary, he was a wonderful whistler. All three men laughed. A whistle is not much to leave behind, said John. Ah, but it was a wonderful whistle, said Stephen. That was no lie either. It was the God's honest truth. That old bastard, mean as he was, he could whistle like a morning songbird. He could pipe like Pan, he could. The men lapsed again into silence. Stephen sipped his drink and looked around. It hasn't changed much, has it, he said. Different feeling to it, though. To the bartender, he said, This place used to be a real Mick bar, years and years ago. Guess that was before my time, the bartender said. The men were quiet again then. John asked the bartender who he favored in the big game, and the bartender said he didn't know. You're wagering there, that's what's got you passing burrs, Johnny, not the whiskey, said Stephen. Ah, there's no interest for me unless I've got something riding on it, said John. Otherwise it's just a game. The men fell silent once again. Then Stephen said, Can you tell me this, Tim? What's the difference between an Irish wedding and an Irish wake? The bartender had heard the joke before, but he'd been tending bar long enough to pretend that he hadn't. He appeared to think about it for a moment, and then he said, I don't know. One drunken Irishman, said Stephen, and all three men laughed again. A lot of truth to that, John said, wiping the tears from his eyes. Stephen stood up and said, I'm done now, brother. Paul's at rest. Let's be on our way. Nice meeting you, Timothy, said John, leaving a healthy tip on the bar and shaking the bartender's hand. Stephen shook it too. See you again, said Stephen, and he picked up his hat, set it on his head at an angle, put his arm around his brother, and the two men walked out of the bar. In another moment, the door opened, light streamed in, and the lunch crowd began to arrive.